Hello and welcome to my Switch Axe guide. I will be covering anything and everything about Switch Axe in this video, so whether you're completely new or experienced, I hope I can provide some value for you. Alright, so Switch Axe is a weapon that can morph between two different weapon modes. There is an axe mode and a sword mode. Each weapon mode has its own unique moveset. In addition, each weapon has attacks that can morph into the other weapon mode. We call these morph attacks. And morph attacks are the most frequent type of attack that you should be using on Switch Axe. The reason for this is because one skill has absolutely defined the playstyle for Switch Axe in Monster Hunter Rise: Rapid Morph. Rapid Morph is an armor skill, and at level 3, it increases morph attack raw damage by 20% and morph attack speed by 30%. This has influenced Switch Axe play significantly, because morph attacks are now the strongest attacks, and in some cases, the quickest attacks you can perform. The general gameplay in Rise and Sunbreak is to be constantly switching back and forth between weapon modes to get as many morph attacks in as you can. Oh yeah, and there's a zero something where you attach to the monster for some unavoidable damage and a big explosion. A major part of Switch Axe play is movement and positioning to be able to accurately attack and defend against your target. It is particularly important on Switch Axe, as Switch Axe only has moderate mobility options compared to other weapons, and this is only considered moderate due to the increased effectiveness of Evade extender in Rise and Sunbreak. So you will be heavily managing your movement options to obtain good positioning and aggression on the monster. And in Sunbreak specifically, you will be maintaining that position with strong defensive options, such as the Elemental Burst counter or the Wire Step. Alright, let's get into the weapon mechanics. Switch Axe has an important buff that needs to be charged up and maintained. This buff is called Amp State. When striking the monster with your sword, a gauge will fill around your Switch Axe gauge. When this is full, it will glow and indicate you are now in Amp State. While in Amp State, the majority of your attacks will have a Phial explosion added to it, though it is worth noting that the Phial burst cannot crit. In Sunbreak, successfully countering with your Elemental Burst counter will immediately put you into Amp State. Switch Axe is a weapon that uses Monster Hunter's special Phial technology. Each Switch Axe has a different type of Phial, and the sword mode uses that Phial to receive different enhancements depending on the Phial type. In addition to sword attacks, any Phial bursts also receive the special effect. For example, element Phials increase the element damage of sword attacks and Phial damage by 45%, and similarly, power Phials increase the same attack's raw damage by 15%. It is worth noting that status element Phials do increase the status applied by 45% as well. Exhaust and Dragon Phials, as you might expect, apply exhaust status and Dragon element. Poison and Paralysis Phial do apply status, however unlike exhaust, status is only applied in 1 out of 3 hits, just like ordinary weapons. While it may seem overwhelming with so many different types of Phials, generally, only element, power, and exhaust Phials should be used in Rise and Sunbreak. So, whenever you use a sword attack, the Phial gauge depletes. If you run out of gauge while in sword mode, you will automatically switch back to axe. If your gauge is below this white line while in axe mode, if you try to morph, you will instead do a Phial reload. This is a very long animation, and you should avoid doing this, as you will see later in this video, there are better ways to refill your Phial gauge. Each Phial type charges amp at a different rate, and it will require a different amount of sword hits to charge up. I have them listed here from fastest to slowest, but I've also added the numeric value required for comparison's sake. You won't see these numbers in game, but it should give you an idea of how fast each Phial type charges relative to each other. Lastly, a special effect of the sword mode is that it has a mind's eye effect, where it will not bounce off a hard monster part where an axe attack would. Alright, let's get into the attack section. First, let's talk about the switch skills. So the first switch skill slot is the forward slash or the forward overhead slash. Forward slash gives an option to remain in axe and do a low commitment attack. I don't see a lot of value in this attack, as with Rapid Morph, either the axe or the sword morph slash is just as quick, but does more damage. The forward overhead slash is a high commitment attack that can have very particular spacing. It can combo into a powerful morph double slash, which can then combo into a triple sword slash. However, this is a very long combo to commit to, and basically only really works when the monster is toppled or immobilized. On top of that, if you do this attack too close, there's a chance you'll overshoot the monster. I personally choose to use the forward overhead. However, in practice, neither of these attacks are used very much, so I would say go with whichever one sounds good to you. The second switch skill slot is the finishing discharge or the compressed finishing discharge. There are two different attacks for the finishing discharge. If you're not in amp state, you poke your sword and have ticking damage until the sword explodes, reducing Phial gauge and dealing a lot of damage and increasing your amp gauge. If you are in amp state, you will perform the zero-sum discharge. You will latch to the monster part you hit with your poke, and then deal unavoidable ticking damage until the final explosion, which launches you off your target. The finishing discharge while not amped just takes too long and forces you to just stand there, so it's not all that good. However, the zero-sum discharge is a very powerful attack as it guarantees damage. This can be very good in moments where you would otherwise not be able to do a lot of damage to the monster. In addition, after being launched off from the final explosion, the Soaring Wyvern Blade Silkbind skill can cancel that into another powerful attack, which negates the major drawback of the long finishing animation. The compressed element discharge performs a large spinning sword slash around you that hits twice for a decent amount of damage. However, the main drawback of this attack is a long ending animation that you cannot cancel, as well as it consumes a very large amount of your Phial gauge. One property of both these attacks is a Phial burst that ignores raw hit zones. This means that this attack's raw damage will always be the same no matter what monster part you attack. This can be particularly good if you're trying to break a hard monster part, such as the head for either of the Metal Wraths. So the choice here is the finishing discharge. Though at higher hunt difficulties, this attack can kill you as you absorb all damage while attached. The compressed just doesn't do enough damage, uses too much Phial gauge, and has too much of an end lag. Though if you like this skill just because it looks cool, I can respect that. There is a combo for the compressed discharge where you first use the Switch Charger Silkbind into the Morph Sword Slash, into the Sword Double Slash, then finally the compressed discharge. Doing this, you do not lose any Phial gauge when performing the attack because the Switch Charger protects your Phial gauge. The third switch skill slot is the Axe Wide Sweep, or the two-stage Morph Slash combo. The Axe Wide Sweep performs a wide axe morph attack that does decent damage. However, there isn't really a choice here. The two-stage morph combo added in Sunbreak provides good damage, the highest amping combo, as well as restoring a lot of Phial gauge. The utility of this combo is too good to pass up. And while the Wide Sweep does do good damage, it doesn't even compete with the strongest combos anyway. The fourth switch skill slot is between three different Silkbind attacks: the Invincible Gambit, the Soaring Wyvern Blade, or the Wire Step. The Invincible Gambit provides hyper armor with a series of 3 axe attacks. It's a good attack, but due to the opportunity cost of the 2 other switch skills, I generally do not use this switch skill. It's not bad, but it lacks a bit in damage as the axe attacks don't get the benefits of the Phial. I do think this is a pretty beginner friendly skill though. It will help with approaching the monster and dealing okay damage. If you do prefer the Invincible Gambit, there are a couple follow-up attacks that you should know about. If you press the top base button, you will perform a special axe side slash, which does pretty good damage. If you press a direction away from where you're facing, and the same button, you perform the wide sweep. And you can also go straight into an axe morph slash with the morph button. The Soaring Wyvern Blade, if used on the ground, will launch you up into the air, and then if you press the top base button, you will dive back down. If you make contact with the monster, it will leave a Phial explosion. This Phial explosion, similar to the Elemental Discharge, will ignore raw hit zones. This attack can provide a decent amount of amp gauge, but also can be used evasively to avoid damage on the ground, kind of like an insect glaive would. However, the main reason this Silkbind is very powerful is that it can be used in the air following a zero-sum discharge. This prevents the long animation afterwards, and instead adds an attack that does a lot of damage, plus it looks really cool. Lastly, the Wire Step. On the surface, this skill has no offensive capabilities, but it gives you a significant amount of invincibility frames on use. But a major benefit is that dodging attacks with the Wire Step works with evade skills like Status Trigger, Adrenaline Rush, and Blade Scale Hone. This makes it great for maintaining Adrenaline Rush or a status playstyle. In higher difficulty hunts, I typically run Wire Step to give me a safe option to dodge, but also to sustain buffs like Adrenaline Rush or Status Trigger. If I do feel like using zero-sum discharge, I typically just run Soaring Wyvern Blade on my other scroll and swap to it. So I think the Wire Step and Soaring Wyvern Blade are very good, but the Invincible Gambit isn't that bad either. The last switch skill slot is for the Switch Charger or the Elemental Burst counter. The Switch Charger dashes you forward and puts you into axe mode, as well as charging a significant amount of Phial gauge. It also provides a very short window where you cannot lose any Phial gauge, and this is indicated by the glowing Phial gauge. Switch Axe Phial gauge has become a bit easier to manage because of the Phial Switch Boost Rampage decoration, so the switch charger is less useful in Sunbreak. In Sunbreak, the elemental burst counter is an essential skill. It simultaneously does a lot of damage, protects you from damage, and immediately puts you into amp state, as well as refreshing amp state if it's already active. This skill is incredibly powerful and has a big effect on the Sunbreak Switch Axe playstyle. So the way the counter works is that there's a startup for the counter, and then you press the right trigger to start the elemental burst. If you take damage from the front during this burst, then you will perform the counter. So my recommendation is to use a burst counter. However, I keep the switch charge on my other scroll in case I need a lot of Phial gauge in a pinch. Alright, before we get into the attacks, combos, and gameplay section, there are two important armor skills to talk about first. As I mentioned in the overview, Rise and Sunbreak heavily incentivize the use of morph attacks. These come from two different sources. The first is Rapid Morph. At level 3, this skill increases your morph attack damage by 20% and the morph attack speed by 30%. You should always run this skill at level 3. The second is the Phial Switch Boost Rampage decoration added in Sunbreak. This further enhances morph attack damage for power and element phials. Phial Switch Boost increases the sword morph attack raw damage by an additional 10% for power phials, and an additional 10% element damage for element phials. And for axe morph attacks, the axe attacks receive the effect of the phial. So for example, the axe morph attacks for power phial receive the 15% additional raw damage. On top of that, both increases the damage from Rapid Morph and Phial Switch Boost also affect the associated Phial bursts when you are in amp state. In addition, Phial Switch Boost increases the Phial gauge returned when performing morph attacks into Axe mode. This makes it so that if you are frequently morphing back and forth, you will never have to worry about your Phial gauge. So because morph attacks are so important, Switch Axe combos tend to exist in loops that can be roughly broken down into 4 stages. A morph attack into sword, some number of sword attacks, a morph attack into axe, some amount of axe attacks, and then a morph attack back into sword. You can also just skip the sword and axe attacks and just loop directly to and from morph attacks. The motivation behind these loops is since morph attacks are the strongest attacks, we want to loop through to do the strongest morph attacks as frequently as possible. For example, the strongest Switch Axe combo involves the sword morph slash, into the sword double slash, into the axe morph double slash, and then into sword morph slash again. I will be covering every attack at each step of this loop, as well as providing context on how the attack can be used, as well as how frequently I think it should be used. So then let's start out with the axe attacks. If you are sheathed, you can draw into an axe attack by holding a direction and pressing the top face button. This will either be an axe side slash or the forward overhead slash, depending on your first switch skill slot. Generally, both of these draw attacks are not very good, and there are better draw attack options in other stages. By pressing the top face button in axe mode, you will perform the overhead slash. This attack has some applications with morph attacks, as you will see in the next section. Continuing to press the same button will loop you into a side slash and rising slash combo. This combo is really bad. There is never a time where you want to use this combo. You can shortcut this into the rising slash with the top and right buttons pressed together. This can be used in very fringe cases where you need to reach a high monster part. Pressing the right face button performs the wild swing. This is the only attack that drains your stamina. You can keep pressing this and the damage will ramp up. Spamming wild swings is also very bad, as there are not any cases where you want to use this repeatedly for damage. However, the wild swing can lead into the heavy axe slam. If you perform 2 wild swings and press the top face button, you will perform the heavy axe slam. This provides a buff that will make your sword attacks charge amp gauge faster. This can be a helpful buff if you are new and are having trouble maintaining amp state, or if you are in multiplayer and the monster does not focus you as much, making it difficult to counter. The damage on this attack is not very good and should not be used for that. The main purpose of using this attack is to get that buff. The wild swing does lead to a great morph attack, and we will get to that in the next section. Lastly, the axe fade slash. This can be used to disengage from the monster. After any attack except for the wild swing, if you press a direction away from where you are facing and the right face button, you will perform the axe fade slash. This attack is pretty good for repositioning, however it is important to note that this attack does not have any iframes, so if you try to use this to avoid an attack, you might still get hit. Let's get into the axe to sword morph attacks. First, the axe morph slash. This is performed by holding a direction and pressing the right trigger. In addition, this can also be performed from sheath, and it is generally your best draw attack. This is the most frequent axe to sword morph attack you will be using. With Rapid Morph and Phial Switch Boost combined, it is a very fast attack and it does a lot of damage. This attack will be the opening attack to a lot of your combos and is one of the most frequent attacks to use on Switch Axe. Next is the Morph Double Slash. This can only be performed by pressing the right trigger after an axe overhead slash. This includes the regular overhead slash, the forward overhead slash, the heavy axe slam, but this can also be performed after the jumping axe slash in the air. This attack is very strong, however the requirement to use the overhead slash makes it less appealing most of the time compared to the morph slash. The overhead slash combined with the morph double slash keeps you locked in animation for a long time. Instead, you can perform multiple quick morph slashes that do similar damage, but it keeps you mobile. Lastly, the two-stage morph slash. This can be performed by pressing the right trigger after a wild swing. The first part of this attack is an axe attack, and the second is basically an axe morph slash. It does the same damage, except it generates 3 times as much amp, and also gives a lot of Phial gauge, especially with Phial Switch Boost. But also, if you press the right trigger during this attack, you will perform the second part of the two-stage morph slash, and morph back into axe. This part of the combo generates a significant amount of amp gauge, and some additional Phial gauge. This morph attack combo is very good. It is not the strongest combo to do, but it is the go-to combo for fixing either your amp gauge or your Phial gauge. Okay, let's take a look at the sword attacks now. First, the Elemental Discharge. If you press both the top and right face buttons, you will perform the Elemental Discharge. After starting this attack, you will need to keep pressing the top face button until you get the finishing discharge. Performing it like this will have a bit of a long animation, and we will see soon that there are combos that make this attack much quicker to perform. A reminder that attaching for the zero-sum discharge only works if you are in amp state, and this attack is only really worth it if you do attach. As mentioned in the switch skills section, zero-sum is especially good for dealing damage to a monster when you otherwise could not, such as when the monster is flying. Next, the double sword slash. This is performed by pressing the right face button. This will likely be the most common sword attack you'll be using while in sword mode, and there are a number of reasons for this. The first and most important reason is that this is the quickest attack that can combo into the strongest morph attack, the Axe Morph Double Slash, which I will talk about in the next section. The double slash also makes the elemental discharge much faster to perform, so typically you want to try to get a double slash in first before attaching for a zero sum. However, I do want to say that performing this with a long animation is still faster than forcing the combo, so if you are in a hurry to use zero sum discharge, don't feel like you must do the double slash. Lastly, the double slash can also lead into the Heavensward Flurry by pressing the right face button again. This is a great combo for charging your amp gauge if you need it. However, it is a big commitment and the damage isn't that great. The Rising Sword Slash combo can be performed by pressing the top face button repeatedly. This is a 3-part combo, and generally, this combo isn't used very much, but there are a couple of fringe cases where you might want to use this. One example is, let's say you want to do a zero sum, but you have more time than just a double slash. You can fit in a couple of rising slashes, then do a double slash into the zero sum discharge. Another is if you need to focus a hard monster part that your axe would bounce off of. With anomaly hunts, this ends up being a thing where you must hit undesirable spots. An additional property of this attack is if you perform all 3 attacks and press a double slash, you will instead perform the triple sword slash. You can also perform the triple sword slash after the morph sword double slash. From there, you can go into any combo that you would from a double slash. The triple sword slash is pretty good, for the same reasons that the double sword slash is, but because of the limited ways to access it, it's just not as great to use. Finally, the Axe Morph attacks. First, the Axe Morph Slash. You can perform this by pressing the right trigger while holding a direction. From my experience, this is an extremely underrated attack. It is very fast, moves you forward, and can combo well into the Sword Morph Slash. If you press the right trigger after a Morph Sword Slash, you will instead perform the stationary Axe Morph Slash. This does the same damage, but it doesn't move you. This attack is also very good, as it is quick, deals good damage, and can go straight into another Sword Morph Slash. I can't emphasize enough how useful these quick morph attacks are. They deal good damage and keep you mobile. I will discuss this in more detail when tying all of this together into gameplay at the end. Holding back and pressing the right trigger after a sword attack will perform the Axe Morph Fade Slash. This attack is much quicker than the Axe Fade Slash and can be pretty helpful when trying to reposition yourself during a combo. In addition, the damage on this attack is pretty good. Last but not least, the Axe Morph Double Slash. This is the strongest morph attack you can perform, and when there is an opening, this is the attack you want to be doing as much as possible. However, being a two-part attack, there is decent commitment to this attack. In addition, it can only be performed after a double or triple Sword Slash or a Heavensward Flurry. So this should be used as much as possible, but carefully, due to the higher commitment. Alright, let's talk about Switch Axe movement options now. In Axe mode, your movement speed will be the normal running speed, and if you press the dodge or roll button, you will perform a roll in any direction. However, after any Axe attack, a forward or back dodge will be a roll, but any side directions will be a hop. You can roll after a hop if you dodge again after the hop. In Sword mode, you will have a walk similar to a Greatsword, and like in Axe mode, you can roll in any direction. Different from Axe, however, any dodge after a sword attack will be a hop, even forwards or backwards. In general, Switch Axe is considered to have poor mobility, and a Evade Extender is highly recommended as this improves the distance of these rolls and hops. I will discuss movement in more detail in the gameplay section, as we also need to factor in the Axe attacks you use while moving. Alright, let's go over some Switch Axe specific armor skills. Rapid Morph level 3 is absolutely mandatory for any build, and I think I've talked about this enough. And similarly, Phial Switch Boost. I'm going to say it. I think you should always use this Rampage decoration. The additional damage and added Phial gauge management make this invaluable for optimal Switch Axe play. Beyond that, we have Sharpness management skills. The common one you will see is Protective Polish. At level 3, this makes your weapon not lose any sharpness for 90 seconds. Despite being a big weapon, Switch Axe attacks vary frequently, so a common strategy is to use enough handicraft to barely get the highest sharpness available, and then lock it in with Protective Polish. Master's Touch is actually a great option on Switch Axe if you have about 30 or more hits of the desired sharpness and a high investment in affinity. You may have heard somewhere that because Phial Burst cannot crit isn't very good. This is misinformed. If you are interested, I have a video discussing it, and honestly, I think I might have to make another one. Moving on to comfort skills. The first one, and one that I highly recommend for most levels of play, is Evade Extender. Evade Extender significantly improves your mobility on Switch Axe by making your hops and rolls significantly longer, and I personally recommend running 1 or 2 points of it, but never 3. 3 is way too much. I think as you become more experienced with Switch Axe, there is a point where you could remove it completely, but for most, I strongly recommend it. I started with Evade Extender 2, and have since moved down to using 1. Next, Power Prolonger. Power Prolonger will extend the length of Amp State by about 15 seconds each point, raising the duration from 45 seconds to 90 seconds at level 3. The use of this at Sunbreak is reliant on whether or not you can maintain Amp State with the Elemental Burst counter. Since the counter refreshes Amp State, you can maintain it as long as you counter every 45 seconds. However, I strongly feel that you should gauge this to your play. Don't be afraid to run this skill if you need it. In multiplayer, countering can be tough, which can make Power Prolonger more valuable. But also, since Element and Exhaust Phials charge fast through ordinary means compared to Power Phial, you may not feel like you need this if you're mostly using Element Phials or Exhaust. I highly recommend adjusting this to your play and to experiment with it. If you find having longer Amp State fits well with your needs, run this skill. I initially started at level 3 most of the time, but after getting more comfortable with the counter, I brought it down to 0. Lastly, Wirebug Whisperer and Wind Mantle. This is heavily dependent on whether or not you're using the counter a lot, and especially so if you both counter and wire step. If you are heavily making use of the counter, I recommend Wirebug Whisperer 3 for the increased length of the third bug, but also the increased recovery rate. After some experimenting, I have not found Wind Mantle to be necessary, as you can only counter so frequently. But adding more recovery rate definitely makes things more comfortable, so add this if you like. I personally always run at least Wirebug Whisperer 3. Finally, let's tie all of this together to discuss combos and general gameplay. The first priority is to get into Amp State. Amp State can account from anywhere between 10 to over 33% of your damage depending on the build. So it is very important to maintain this buff. So like most weapons, in practice, Switch Axe only has a couple of combos that you end up doing over and over again. The first is simply the strongest combo we can perform, which is frequently called the Rapid Morph loop. Given the opportunity, this is the combo that should be used when trying to do the most damage given that you are in amp state. The combo involves the Morph Sword Slash, into the Sword Double Slash, into the Axe Morph Double Slash, and then loops back in with the Morph Sword Slash. There are two combos that are the best for charging amp state. These are the 2-stage Morph Slash and the Heavensward Flurry. Whenever you are not amped, the nearest combo should be used, which basically means that if you are in Sword, do the Heavensward Flurry. If you are in Axe, use the 2-stage. These two combos are strictly weaker than the Rapid Morph loop, but in general, getting amp state is more important if you do not have it. The combos I just talked about are higher commitment combos which can be harder to perform when the monster is moving and attacking you. So let's discuss lower commitment attacks that help with your movement and positioning. These will primarily be the Morph Sword Slash and the Morph Axe Slash. The Morph Sword Slash is your bread and butter poke in Rise and Sunbreak. It can close a short gap and leaves you in a great position to continue attacking or adjust to a defensive option. Typically, a great follow-up to the Morph Sword Slash is the Sword Double Slash. However, the Axe Morph Slash is a great alternative that is lower commitment. An additional note is that if you hop after the Sword Slash, you can instead do the moving Axe Morph Slash. In fact, if you do an Axe Morph Slash into another Sword Morph Slash, this does more damage than if you had done a Sword Double Slash. This means that the Sword Double Slash only does more damage than looping through the quick Morph Slashes if you use it to link into the Axe Morph Double Slash. It might seem ridiculous, but looping through these two quick Morph Slashes only ends up being 5 to 10% weaker than the Rapid Morph loop hit for hit. The main drawback of this combo is that it constantly moves you forward, so if you do need to stand still, the Sword Double Slash might be more appropriate. These attacks lead nicely into movement and positioning, probably the most important aspect of Switch Axe. Short attacks give you more opportunities to react to attacks. This is important because the Elemental Burst counter requires a bit of time to prepare, so with these quick attacks, you have more opportunities between attacks to dodge, hop, or perform a counter. The counter is a very important part of Sunbreak Switch Axe play. It allows you to simultaneously maintain your positioning, deal good damage, and sustain your amp gauge. The counter is more awkward to use than other counters as it takes half a second to prepare it, so it can be more proactive than reactive. I recommend using the quick morph attacks to frequently give you the opportunity between attacks to use a counter or dodge. Don't be concerned about preemptively preparing the counter and the monster doesn't do anything. This is very normal. Just drop the counter and continue. You can either just release the counter to do damage or just side hop out of it. For practice, I recommend either of the Rajangs or a Tigrex. These monsters will constantly attack you most of the time, so you can practice having the counter ready before the attacks. I want to add that if you use Wire Step, this works out very well, as between attacks you can either choose to Wire Step if the attack is coming too fast, or prepare a counter if there is enough time to counter. Zero Sum Discharge is a great attack, but do be careful with it as in higher difficulty hunts it can be dangerous. However, this attack is really good to create opportunities for dealing good damage when you otherwise could not. Or, if you need to break monster parts, it is great for focusing just one part. Between different builds and playstyles, the fundamental combos and movement largely all stay the same. The main difference would be the evade focused builds that want to maintain evade armor skills like Adrenaline Rush and Status Trigger. Switch Axe is generally most effective by using Element, and I explained the reason for that in a different video. However, raw status builds like Exhaust are also quite strong and pretty good for more general purpose or narrow raw matchups. If you are looking for builds for Switch Axe, I have builds on the channel from all the different title updates. You can use the older builds if you are not completely up to date. A couple of final odds and ends that I couldn't find a spot to fit into the guide. If a monster is sleeping and you set barrel bombs on a weak spot, countering it while standing on the bombs will trigger your counter due to the hit lag. If your Phial gauge is below the threshold that would cause you to reload, you can perform a counter and hop out of it to quickly switch it to sword without reloading. Thank you so much for watching my Switch Axe guide. This took an absolutely immense amount of work and I really hope that it is helpful to you. If you do have any questions, leave a comment. I try to get to all the comments. You can support me and the channel by simply giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. More content is planned and on the way, but there are more videos on the channel if you want to continue to learn about Switch Axe. Thanks for watching, Hunters. Take care.